In this video, I will talk about opacity and rgba colors. The opacity property enables us to adjust the transparency of an element. It extends from 0 to 1, 1 being totally opaque, 0 being totally translucent, meaning you can see right through it, similar to a window. Anywhere in between enables us to see partially through the element. So if you look at my example here, I have an H1 element with some text inside a container. The container has a background image in it. As you can see, the color of the H1 element, which is black, has a degree of opacity, meaning you can see some of the picture through the letters. It is also quite obvious that the background color has a degree of opacity because it is easy to see some of the background. This makes a very nice effect. This is accomplished by setting the opacity property to a value for that element or for that selector. In CSS, it is very common to place a 0 in front of the decimal. The reason being that it alerts us to the fact that that is in fact a decimal rather than a possible mistake. I would like to point out that in CSS we can shorten a hexadecimal value from 6 characters to 3. If the characters are in duplicates of the same letter or number, they can be represented by just one of that letter or number. Here we see the opacity, and I would like to stress that it affects the entire element. Looking at the code, we are setting the opacity property for the H1 element. rgba is a color value. If you're familiar with Photoshop, you're familiar with an alpha channel. That is a degree of transparency. We have already learned about RGB values. We can add another channel, which is a decimal value ranging between 0 up to 1.0. And that will give us that same degree of transparency or opacity that we have just seen in the previous example. The difference being RGBA is a color value. It only affects the color. It does not affect the entire element. So here, if I was applying the rgba color value to my H1 element, it would only apply to the text of that H1 element. It would not apply to the entire H1 element. Notice in my code, I have the color written twice. Consequently, the second property and value would be applied because that would take precedence over the first one. So why am I doing this? You may commonly see developers doing this, and it is referred to as progressive enhancement. In the early days, when CSS3 was first introduced, not all browsers supported those properties. Therefore, we devised a backup plan. If the browser does not recognize RGBA, it will ignore it and it will apply the color. So nothing is lost and nothing is broken. So rgba is a color value that contains a degree of transparency. The opacity property affects the degree of transparency or opacity of the entire element or selector.